I'm standing here in front of an enormous boulder. But the question is, why is this boulder sitting in this field? How did it get here? Did it just rise up out of the ground? Did the ground just erode around it, leaving this monumental boulder behind me? Or is there a better explanation? The subject of this lesson is the inspiration and the bravery of one man over a 40-year period. J. Harlan Bretz was a geologist who was fascinated by the geology of the central and eastern Washington area. J. Harlan Bretz proposed what by his peers was called an outrageous hypothesis. Now, why did they call it that? Before I get to that, there's often a scientific consensus in the thinking and teaching of a majority group of scientists, and it happens even today. And it's often presented that because there's a consensus in the scientific community, well, the news media would imply or present that therefore it must be a fact, whether it's global warming or ozone holes or in any topic. Consensus is interpreted as fact by those who listen. But you understand, 100% of people could believe something, and that does not make it true. Truth exists outside of consensus. Now, why do I start by talking in this way? You see, in 1925, as he was looking at the geology of this area, he started to understand that he was surrounded by evidence that it had not accumulated by slow, gradual processes. And that had been the mindset throughout the geological community for over 100 years. Starting in Europe and spreading across the pond, the Atlantic Ocean, geologists are trained throughout their education that the present is the key to the past. In other words, slow, gradual processes, rivers carving out canyons, erosion of a grain of a sand at a time off a hillside would require millions of years to have carved out large river valleys to transform landscapes. So this is the way they're trained to think. It's called uniformitarianism. But as J. Harlan Bretz looked at the surrounding landscapes of this area of the country, he saw evidence after evidence after evidence. It could not possibly have been slow, gradual processes that transformed this area. So he started to collect various pieces of information to support this hypothesis. And then in 1927 in Washington, D.C., at a conference of the U.S. Geological Society, he presented such a paper with these evidences. It caused a firestorm of controversy because what Bretz had proposed was that an enormous flood event had totally transformed a large area of a single state of the United States, part of Idaho, a little bit of Montana, all the way out to the Pacific Ocean area. Now, this sounded a little bit too much like the global flood of the Bible to the geologists of the day. They accused him of heresy. Now, heresy is a religious concept, and yet his proposal was heresy to the consensus thinking of the day, that a single flood could have carved out enormous valleys, coulees, which are simply deep eroded ruts between surrounding ridges on either side, transported enormous rocks long distances, created a waterfall 3.5 miles wide with water extending hundreds of feet above the water as it eroded out and rapidly created new valleys downstream of this riverfall. These are the kind of things that Bretz proposed. Now, to just show how can you know whether someone who is opposing your idea, if you're in a scientific field, is basing his opposition on scientific facts and evidence, or if he's basing his ideas on a philosophical starting point or viewpoint, you have to look at the objections that are thrown out. And I'm just going to give you one example. This area of Washington State, there are a series of what are called coulees. Now, they are literally like the gaps between ridges that have been carved out in some way, either a slow, gradual process or a rapid, catastrophic removal of that sediment. And they stretch over hundreds of miles. They run roughly in the same direction, but they're spread out. And the question was, how did these coulees arrive? How did these valleys between the ridges arise? Well, J. Harlan Bretz realized they were all eroded down to the same level. So if they had formed over different time periods by different floods, the water carving out one would have backed up the next valley and caused continued erosion, and they would have ended up being at different depths at different times. It is really conceptually impossible for valleys that were eroded millions of years separated in time to all just have ended up at exactly the same level. And so how could that be if it wasn't an enormous flood that created these valleys? Well, those who believe in the huge periods of time can't get past that philosophical underpinning in spite of the evidence, not because of the evidence. They propose things such as, well, maybe one of these coulees were eroded out and then it was lifted to a different level while another one was eroded out and then it was lifted to the same level. Another was eroded out and it was lifted to the same level. You see how conceptually almost absurd this kind of thinking is. So what did Bretz do? Did he just conform to the majority of opinion? No, he saw the evidence. He realized, no, it has to be true. Now at this time, he didn't even know where the water came from. He made various proposals of lakes and such that may have drained, but it wasn't until 1932 he came back with another paper, had realized that during the Ice Age period of the Earth, there had to have been enormous water backed up behind this lake that had flooded a very large area in Montana and above. As the ice melted, things weakened, it broke through, and in a matter of days, unimaginable amounts of water broke through, rapidly carving out these coulees, carrying rocks, creating huge waves, laying down enormous gravel beds. We're going to look at some of these evidences throughout this episode. And he brought back evidence after evidence after evidence to put before the other experts of the day. And were they convinced? They continued to propose improbable, impossible solution after impossible solution. Bretz continued to show how their ideas could not possibly explain the geology of this area. It took 40 years before enough geologists realized what he had been teaching was absolutely true. It wasn't until the 1960s when they finally said, let's go look at the field evidence for ourselves, and some very influential men came and they looked at some of these dry waterfalls and some of these erratic boulders that like this that are just out of place, and came to the realization themselves, he is right. It is enormous catastrophes that would have created features such as this on our planet. So let's take this and look at this evidence and examine it for ourselves and follow the trail that led J. Harlan Bretz to his conclusion that floods, little tiny versions of catastrophic events, are a reality of the history of this planet. We are here in central Washington to look at yet another feature testifying to the Missoula flood. J. Harlan Bretz, as he was teaching geology in the Chicago area for over 10 years, he would come and study this area of eastern Washington because he was fascinated by the geology of this area. And one of the things that attracted his attention, I believe, first and perhaps most, was this enormous leftover cliff that he realized had to have been an ancient waterfall. But as he went through geology and he studied how water forms things, he realized these looked very much like what you would expect from a massive waterfall. Because at the bottom of the cliff, there's an enormous pool that has been dug out. It's now filled with water, but what created that pool at the bottom? They're called plunge pools, and you find them at the bottom of very large waterfalls that with enormous force are forcing water down as it's pounding into the ground, it's digging out this pit. But it wasn't just the plunge pools at the bottom of these cliffs that caught J. Harlan Bretz's imagination. There is an entire series of lake after lake and pit after pit heading 20 miles up a carved out valley leading to a place called Soap Lake. He realized it looks exactly like Niagara Falls, which is receding about 3 feet per year away from Lake Ontario. And yet the scope of this waterfall, which is now dry because there's no water flowing over it, dwarfs anything we see happening today. The ridge goes for 3.5 miles. He started to think the water that would have been required to have carved out this valley and the Grand Coulee upstream of it, and the scablands that cover a large part of eastern Washington, are beyond comprehension of anything he had ever been taught. He collected example after example that supported the reality that an enormous flood had to have created this area, and presented this to the geological community. And I believe it was this evidence from this waterfall that convinced him most strongly, and yet it brought the most ridicule into his life. The water pouring over this 3.5 mile waterfall, carving out 20 miles of a valley, forming plunge pool after plunge pool. It literally dug out cubic miles of sediment. It's an unimaginable amount. And it just spread and fanned the sediment over an enormous area of Washington as the flood continued to head downstream. Now, to really understand the magnitude and the significance of this waterfall during the Missoula flood, I'd like John to describe what was happening as this water flowed over this area.
This is a huge waterfall. Actually, for a period of 2 days, it was the largest waterfall in the whole world. So Dry Falls, during its short life, was 5 times the size of Niagara Falls. Measuring from the bottom to the top edge of the waterfall is about 400 feet. But think of this, the water coming over that falls was 300 feet more on top of that. This waterfall was actually in Soap Lake, which is 20 miles south of here. And during that 2 days, it carved its way back. It's called the receding waterfall. And as the water plunges down to the bottom, there's such turbulence that it actually undercuts the cliff, and it works its way back in so many feet per day. Well, here we have a great view of Grand Coulee. And this is an amazing thing. Try to picture, can you see the fields on top of the ridge on the other side? Try to imagine those fields stretching all the way across, and this huge gorge never was here. This gorge was actually cut in a matter of a couple days. As Lake Missoula burst out, this was the main channel that it took. So Grand Coulee is actually 50 miles long and is as much as 5 miles wide. So those cliffs over there are 900 feet high, and the water was almost near the top of that.
The Grand Coulee was carved by Lake Missoula floodwaters, taking away basalt, okay? Now the basalt is the Columbia River basalt, which is lava flow. So what we're looking at here is the parallel layers, one upon the other. As the lava cools, and you see it's pretty well horizontal, layer upon layer. As it cools, it forms what we call columns. If I illustrate it this way, if you made a batch of taffy and then you measured it after it cooled, measured it before and after it cooled, and you'd see it shrunk a little bit. Well, this Columbia River basalt is going to shrink a little bit, but it's covering hundreds of square miles, so it can't shrink like the taffy could as a body. It shrinks a little bit here and here and here and here. In each of those places it shrinks, it makes a column. And the columns can have straight sides. The best columns, perfect, it would be 6 sides, okay? They can be less, they can be more, okay? But anyway, the columns are formed, and they can be large columns, they can be small columns. Large columns, if it's a longer time cooling, because new layers have come over the top of it, slowing the cooling down. As you get towards the top, as you see up there, the columns are smaller because they're cooling faster. All of this lava, the Columbia River basalt lava, was laid down in a year's time. Noah's flood, okay, it had to happen. Now let's look across Grand Coulee, across the water, and you see the layers of basalt on the other side, Okay, notice that they're stacked like pancakes, flow after flow after flow, underwater, Noah's flood, and there was no erosion time because it's all underwater. So that's why they remain flat. You know, because if there was erosion, you would have big cross-cutting valleys cut across it, which would have to be filled by the next layer of lava before it can continue. We don't see any of that. Now, there could not have been millions of years with this kind of a scenario. It was all happening within the year's time that this lava was flowing, because each layer of basalt is stacked one upon the other.
Now, as you look at this map, the gray areas represent the extent of the water flow that happened out of this ancient Lake Missoula, which had backed up at the later stages of the Ice Age, which covered this planet following the worldwide flood. Now, as the ice sheets were retreating, enormous amounts of water were flowing into this lake. Eventually, it broke through a channel, filling up a glacial lake here, and then breaking through across the upper area of Washington State. This water then, very rapidly, and we're not talking years, decades, we're talking a matter of days, flowed down through a plethora of channels, creating and gouging out these enormous coulees, these deep, deep valleys, square, straight-edged valleys that we've witnessed throughout this talk. One of the things we witnessed was dry falls. 3.5 mile wide waterfall, that was at the end of the Grand Coulee over here. So all this water over a 100-mile area is flowing down into southern Washington. Well, the water hit a natural bottleneck at Missoula Gap, backing up the water, slowing down the drainage, and then it would drop. Gravel basins and enormous amounts of sediment in this area as it continued to just erode through this gap, hitting another slowdown in the dells in the Columbia River Gorge area, backing up again into an enormous lake area called Lake Condon. As it continued to drain and drain and drain, it filled the Willamette Valley in western Oregon. Now, this whole area, all of these areas that were filled with sediment, this sediment came, it was just stripped from the channeled scablands and other areas, pushed downstream, the sediment would fall. Today, many of these areas are filled with fruit trees and very fertile areas for the farmers to grow. But ultimately, all of this water, trillions of gallons of water that drained in a matter of days from an area, hundreds and hundreds of miles to the northeast, drained out into the Pacific Ocean, leaving this decimated, scoured area, ancient lake valleys, very high cliffs throughout the area that we've witnessed throughout this talk. One of the primary evidences that J. Harlan Bretz brought to the geological community in 1927 were these parallel massive coulees that are carved in the Washington area. We're standing here at the Grand Coulee, where one of the main channels of water flowed during this enormous flood of the Ice Age period. And yet it was totally disregarded as having been carved by an enormous flood by the rest of the folks who were studying the geology of the area. Now, why was this? They would look at a valley and they'd say, well, how did that valley get there, carved out of this basalt or lava flow rock? Well, they would typically attribute it to a river or at times maybe glaciers pushed through this area. Well, it doesn't fit the evidence. You see, a river, when it carves down in sort of a V shape with the river at the bottom and fairly steep angular slopes. A glacier builds up and shoves through and creates more of a circular U-shaped slope. And yet these coulees or valleys, they're kind of rectangular. They have very, very steep walls and somewhat of a flat bottom. What would carve a valley like this? Well, we can know by doing flood models and flume studies. In very, very high rates of speed, lots of sediment, very energetic waters in massive quantities can downcut very vertical cliffs. That's exactly what we see in this coulee. Now, what Harlan Bretz saw was these parallel ruts spread over hundreds of miles, these parallel coulees or valleys. It's like an enormous flood, 100 miles or more wide, came flowing through an area and then started to channel into parallel areas, digging out these very deep valleys. The evidence fits an enormous flood, And yet, because geologists are trained to think slow, gradual processes, eons of time, they couldn't see this sort of evidence, even when it was very clear and very apparently placed before them. Behind me, you'll see another example of the kind of evidences which J. Harlan Bretz brought to the geological community. There's this long, tan, sloping surface that is, in essence, loose, unconsolidated sediment, gravel and sand and soil and various particles of ground-up rock, in essence. The question is, how did it get there? It's almost 300 feet deep. Above it, you'll see basalt. Now, how did the gravel get there? The typical uniformitarian explanation is, well, you know, this valley was carved out by slow flows of water over millions of years, and somehow sediment formed in that area. Except it doesn't really make sense. Why would it be high in just that area? Why is it just unconsolidated gravel? Well, Bretz presented the correct explanation. Ultimately, it's been acknowledged as the correct explanation. Enormous amounts of water came flowing through this coulee, which is, just remember, that's another word for a valley. It actually flowed over top of the basalt you see behind me, which is about 600 feet tall. At that point, the channel widens out, the water flow slows down, and the sediment contained within the water starts to settle out, building up an enormous gravel bar. You see, the evidence fits perfect with a rapid, catastrophic development of this area. And yet, as clear as this kind of evidence was, the geological community continued to be blind to the reality because their perspective was too narrow. They couldn't see the big picture of an enormous regional flood. We are now above the sediments that the Missoula flood would have laid down. And here there's a very just loose aggregate of all sorts of gravel and rocks and you know, small boulders. Can you explain, Dennis, how would this have come about? And does the evidence of what it looks like, does it fit this slow, gradual, millions of years accumulation, or a very rapid accumulation by an enormous flood?
Well, first thing, if we're talking about millions of years, this stuff should be long gone because it carries away so easy. It's not consolidated, it's not cemented together. Okay,
it would long ago have worn away.
Right.
Yeah, but
So
it's still here.
let's talk about the sequence from the top. Okay. I'll talk about the very top layer last, but we're talking about that bedding up there with quartzites and other rocks, other finer gravels on top. That was a high energy flow because things are not stratified. Down here we've got layers in here. That's not stratified. It was just brought in there with fast moving current and dumped on top. So if we start at the bottom and we work our way up, now down here at the bottom we have high energy again. Okay, we'll take that one out, maybe the whole hillside will fall away. That's a big one. The bigger rocks, like the one he just pulled out, and there's a bigger one right behind him there, it took higher energy, more ability of speed of water to carry that size and move that size of rock. There's one there. These lighter colored ones are the quartzites.
And just for clarification, as I understand it, these can be traced to a source hundreds of miles away. So they have been transported by water for hundreds of miles.
How about from Montana, the Belt Supergroup carried across the panhandle of Idaho and then spread out across Washington.
It would take a lot of high-speed water or they wouldn't be here.
Yeah, so it was the water impounded by Lake Missoula flood, dammed up by a lobe called the Purcell lobe of the Ice Age continental ice field up in Canada. So anyway, that's where it came from, but there's a lot of other things that were picked up along the way, so we don't have a lot of quartzites in this particular bedding. So faster flow down here, then it slows up. We got mostly sands here for a while, and then we're getting back into a mixture of half-inch and smaller gravels with some bigger rocks in it. And we get up here, now you're starting to see more layers again, and you're seeing a little bit of cross bedding here, not much. Oh, the holes, what are the holes?
Well,
bird nests, so bank swallows. Okay, now look at this. There's a row that is all at a certain speed, and then it slowed down again, the smaller stuff. Get to the top, the brownish color there, it's got a lot of fine sediment, a little bit of sand, but it doesn't have any quartzites or other gravels. So that was a slower moving flow, so it couldn't carry bigger stuff. Then on top of that was a quite fast moving batch of water, and that deposited that, 4 to 5 foot deep with a lot of different larger material in it, like what we have down here. So that's the sequence. And then on the very top, as that fast moving water carrying, and it takes faster moving water to carry bigger stuff, it slows down, and as it slows down, all the big stuff's been dropped. Now it's only dropping the fine materials, and that's why the top layer is very fine.
Yeah. So the fact that you've got large conglomerates, layered sequences, fine sediment, and then a whole nother repeat of that would illustrate wave after wave of enormously high-speed flowing water has swept through this area.
Yes, yeah. And this was not the Missoula flood deposit.
Right. As I said, it was above that level.
Right, so this is Noah's flood.
One other very, very strong evidence for a world-covering deluge is that there are thousands of water gaps in the hills all over this planet. You'll see this gap between the two cliffs on each side. The Columbia River actually flows through this gap. And yet the problem is that hillside was there before that river ever started to flow through that gap. The river should have flowed around that hillside, not cut a ridge right through that hillside. So how did this happen? How did this happen here and in thousands of other locations around the earth where water seemed to have cut right through raised hills? Well, the answer is those hills were covered with 1,000 foot or more of water during the flood of Noah. The sediment layers had been laid down, and then the water was rushing off of these land surfaces, causing mass sheet erosion over top of the hills, but it would find weak spots where it would start to channel, and it would literally cut gaps through ridges and hills as the water flowed off of the continent. This is a classic example of a water gap. Now, if there was only one, well, maybe a slow rising of the hills on either side simultaneously could have left that gap in between. But we find it all over the place, all over the planet we find these gaps because Noah's flood is a real event. So J. Harlan Bretz, he would bring lots of evidence for his view that the entire area was carved out by a very major flood event.
Right.
One of these evidences were enormous ripple marks and then the dropping of suspended sediment as this huge flood ripped through the area. Right. Can you kind of explain, as we look at the area behind us, how this flood explains it?
Yeah, well, we have right behind us here about a 600-foot deep gravel bar, and that dropped right in the lee of those rocks there.
How high was this water, and how fast was it moving?
Well, it must have been at least as high as the cliffs behind us there, and I don't know, maybe 50, 60 miles an hour in places.
I don't have a good feel for how fast that is. I mean, how fast does like the Columbia River normally flow?
Oh, 4 miles an hour.
And like a mountain creek that's rushing down a mountain, what would be that?
You get a torrent, like a flash floods, they get up to 20 or maybe at the max 30 miles an hour.
The fastest mountain stream you can see.
Yeah.
You've got water 1,000 foot deep almost, flowing twice that fast.
Yeah, and that's what is required to drop the kind of boulders we've seen along the way, as well as carry this 600 feet of gravel and drop that.
Yeah. How would someone who didn't believe there was an enormous flood that created this gravel bar, how would they explain it?
That's a good question, but you have to realize that the premise you start with gives you the results you end up with. And if you start with a premise that's faulty, then you're going to have to come up with very creative answers for what we see, including the 600-foot gravel bar dumped behind us And then over here, on the other side of the river, we see giant ripple marks that I think they must be about 50 or 60 feet between each crest of the ripple mark. Columbia River is turning left here. It's going downstream that way, and there's a big turn here to the left. And so we're on the outside, or the fast water portion of it, and that's why the cliffs over there are so steep. There was much more erosion on the outside of the turn. The inside of the turn is slower, and it's dropping finer sediment. And then on top of the sediment that got dropped is ripple marks, the same kind of ripple marks you see as the water on the beach.
So it's just the scale of these things that is outside the thinking of the geologist of that day.
That's right.
And
it said that the far side of that gravel over there is 600 feet deep.
600 feet of gravel and sediment that's just dropped out.
And the top of it has these massive, giant ripple marks.
And honestly, they themselves are as 100 feet high and hundreds of feet between them. So if you're standing next to them, you don't even see them as ripples.
You don't see them.
Just little mounds and hills.
Yeah.
Well, I can kind of understand how people might have missed it. Their perspective was wrong. It wasn't wide enough.
It wasn't big enough. They weren't thinking big enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we've come full circle, and we're back to our enormous rock in the middle of the field to ask, how did it get here? Well, again, these are the kind of evidences that J. Harlan Bretz saw as he examined the geology of this area. You understand, this is basalt, which is essentially cooled lava, but where did it come from? Remember dry falls? That water, that 200 to 300 foot of water flowing over that falls, a couple hundred feet above that falls, it pulverized the basalt of that area. It pulled it off in huge chunks. But how do you get a rock of this size, millions of pounds, moved miles away from its source? This field is filled with basalt that have been moved from its source. It would take enormous velocities of water filled with other rocks and sediments, tumbling, rolling, pushing these sort of things forward to have moved it this distance. The reason this rock is sitting in this field is not because it was blown out of a volcano and landed here. It's not because the ground around it eroded away. It's because water picked it up and moved it. That is the power of moving water. Now let's transition from the kind of things that happened here locally in Washington State because of what was really a monumental flood to a bigger perspective, to stepping back and looking at the entire Earth, where we see things that dwarf the movement of this giant boulder to the movement of what is in essence the very foundations of the entire Earth. We have been all up and down Western Washington and the Columbia River Gorge looking at the evidence that it was a massive flood that carved out this area. Now, what you'll notice throughout is the blindness of the geological community to acknowledging the massive power of flood to rapidly change the features of our planet. Now, even this flood that caused massive geological changes over a very short period of time is minuscule compared to the kind of things happening all over the globe during the flood of Noah talked about in the Bible. Perspective is everything. Your overall perspective will guide how your brain is going to interpret evidence. I want to take a moment before we wrap up and show you a little clip from a scientist who did an experiment of how our brain sees things based on its perspective. Watch this little demonstration.
Now, as I step into this room, it should be quite obvious that something is wrong, but can you figure out what it is? Your mind may tell you that I have grown smaller. Of course, you know that that really isn't true. Your eyes, however, are telling you the truth. They're telling you that the floor is tilted up, that the ceiling is tilted down, that the walls are badly distorted, that the windows would be almost impossible to make drapes for them. Yes, your eye is telling you all this, but your mind simply refuses to believe it. But maybe this will help. Imagine all of this without benefit of vitamins. But it also works the other way, too. Now, if you'll just step back a bit, you'll see the real cause of the trouble. It's quite obvious at this distance, isn't it? Sloping floor, tilted ceiling, distorted walls. But since you understand this, you shouldn't have a bit of trouble from now on, should you? Or should you? In this house, faces at the window seem to come in assorted sizes, don't they? But there's nothing wrong with the faces. It's those windows and what they're doing to your brain, remember? A small one and a tall one. Let's see if we can even things out a bit. Oh, no, that's even worse. It comes as a distinct shock to most people when they realize how limited and how inaccurate the human senses really are.
When you had a wider perspective, your brain clearly saw. Those were different sized windows, those were different angles. The floor was very distorted. And that is what makes people look different when standing in different spots. And yet if your perspective is very narrow, you're just looking at a very narrow view of things, you can't even see the obvious. Your brain works to maintain what you believe to be the truth, that those windows are the same size, the same shape, and it will distort people's very size as you look at this viewpoint. That is what is happening all over the scientific community. They start with a very narrow perspective. Things happening today are the way they have always happened throughout history. There's never been major, massive changes that have caused the geology of the Earth to rapidly change. As a result, they have the wrong perspective and they misinterpret with the rock layers. So how do we know whether there has been this massive worldwide flood or a little local event? You see, it's the worldwide flood that gives us that bigger perspective of history. But if we leave it out of our thinking, we're going to misinterpret the rock layers. We're going to misunderstand how enormous river valleys could have been carved out rapidly. And we're going to misunderstand the accuracy of God's Word and the true history of this planet. That's why these things are important, because they confirm the accuracy of God's Word in every dot and every detail. Throughout this lesson, we've been talking about the Ice Age and the events that happened subsequent to the Ice Age in the Washington, Oregon area. Now, whenever you hear about the Ice Age in textbooks or nature programs, it's always assumed that it happened over hundreds of thousands of years, starting about 200,000 years ago and kind of petering out about 12,000 years ago. And those are the kind of dates you always hear. They always use these very old time frames and paint people as kind of ignorant, scraping out of existence during this period of Earth history. Now, one of the primary evidences or proofs that those who believe in evolution use to support these kind of time frames are ice cores. They go to Antarctica and they'll go into these huge glaciers that are often miles deep, and they'll take core drillings of these ice sheets. Now, as ice packs down deeper and deeper, there is so much weight, it compresses the ice, and you'll see very fine lines in these cores, and these lines are assumed to be seasons, winter, summer, and they can count them and come up with, literally hundreds of thousands of individual cores when they count these lines in these core drilled sheets of ice that they've taken out of Antarctica and other places. Well, no one was there to see this ice form. All of that is interpretation based on a belief in enormous periods of Earth history. But how old are these ice sheets and how long did they take to form? To learn that, I'm going to take you back to World War II, and we're going to talk about the lost squadron of P-38 Lightnings. Now, what does that have to do with Earth history? Well, you have to understand the whole story. You see, in 1945, there was a squadron of P-38s that were flying over Greenland on their way to Europe to join the war effort when they were forced down onto a glacier by an enormous snowstorm. Well, that storm continued and continued. The pilots actually made it out to a nearby base, but they had to abandon their airplanes, and they were left stranded there in 1945 on this glacier in Greenland. Well, a group of businessmen from, I believe it was Tennessee, read about this in the 1970s, and they thought, you know what? Those airplanes are still sitting up there on that glacier in Greenland. I think we ought to just fly up there, dust the snow off the wings, and fly one of those puppies home. And that's exactly what they set out to do. Except it took 10 years and over $1 million just to extract one of those airplanes. Expeditions worked for year after year to extract these airplanes. Why was it so hard? Why not just dust the snow off of them? Because from 1945 till 1975, snow continued to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate in this area of Greenland. And those airplanes were buried under 250 feet of ice. Now it takes 2,500 feet of snow to turn into 250 feet of ice. In only 30 years, 250 feet of ice formed in this one area of Greenland. You understand, during the Ice Age on our planet, there was enormous snowstorm after snowstorm. These lines we see in these ice cores are not seasons and annual events. They are merely snowstorms where enormous amounts of snow build up. There may have been a melting down and compaction period in between, and then another snowstorm would build up, creating another layer. The thousands of feet of ice that we find in these ice cores are not proof of hundreds of thousands of years of Earth history. They're merely the rapid accumulation of ice during the Ice Age period of this Earth, which followed Noah's flood. And the fact that 250 feet of ice could have buried those airplanes in a mere 30 years shows how fast ice can actually build up.